My name is Poppy and I will be your tutor for the Boro Textiles tote bag. So we are going to be spending the next 4 weeks together, and it obviously started this morning, but I understand that both of you weren't able to attend. So this recording is for Mandy and Jackie, who couldn't make it. So I just think it might be a bit easier to make this recording rather than trying to follow the joint meeting, just because it's a little bit all over the place. And I can make it a lot more condensed rather than 2 hours, just in terms of telling you what you'll need to know for next week. So what I'll do, I will share my screen with you and just talk you through a presentation. I reckon this will probably take maximum half of an hour. Just to tell you a little bit about the background of Sashiko and Boro. And then hopefully we can catch you all up for next time so you're not missing out on anything. Yeah, okay, let's get started. So I've also decided that due to just problems connecting, that we're going to be moving from Microsoft Teams as our platform to meet on to Zoom, as it's been tried and tested before, and no one's had any problems with it, particularly in terms of audio. So fingers crossed that that will help you attend successfully next time, and that you can hear me clearly, as I know that was an issue before. So I will share my screen with you and get going. So we'll be together over the next 4 weeks, and this session, the first session that you missed, will be focusing on the history, the function and the uses of Boro and Sashiko. We will be also looking to prepare our fabric, but I understand that not everyone will had the fabric this session, so please make that part of your homework task, and do refer to the email that I sent you, as that has everything in there that you will need to know. So that has the materials that I purchased. I also referred to a website for some patterns, Sashiko patterns. So do use that and refer to that to help you. But I think it'll be helpful to watch this first. So let's have a look through. So these are all the other learners within the course. Fiona's no longer attending, but there's Kathy, Valerie, Jacqueline and Mandy, and also Sue. We don't need to use this as we won't be using Teams, we'll be using Zoom. So the aims and objectives of the course. So week 1, as I mentioned, we'll be looking at the history and function and uses. But next week we'll be doing Sashiko patterns, spending a little bit more time on that. Looking at designs of our bag in full, maybe sharing the ideas that we had during this space in between the 2 weeks. We'll be looking at how to use our equipment that we've purchased as well. So I will next time show you the individual learning plan, which I refer to on this screen as your ILP. So what I'll do next time is just talk you through this in full, and just explain where I need you to make some notes on. The ILP is really lovely, even though it's a bit of paperwork, a bit extra work to do. It enables me to kind of give you feedback as your tutor, and also enable you to kind of reflect on what you've learned and what stage you're at. And yeah, I think it's just a really nice thing that I can use to, in line with your interest, signpost you to other things after the course is finished as well. So week 3 is also, we'll develop the bag and the processes that we've learned. So we'll be combining all the skills that we've learned together in week 3. And hopefully by week 4, we would have constructed our bag and it'll be completely complete. And then we'll also just sign off the course and finish our ILPs, individual learning plans as well. So they're the full aims, objectives of the course. I will flip past this one. So Boro roughly translates from Japanese to English as like kind of tattered rags, and it's a method that you use to repair fabric. So Boro is patchworking, and it refers to the practice of reworking and repairing textiles through piecing, patching and stitching in order to extend the fabric's use. Traditionally in Japan, Boro is it almost looks like this lovely kind of colour series, this like constant how would you explain it best? Let's try and have a think. I would kind of explain it as like a kind of colour swatch of indigo blue, because this indigo dyed hemp is very traditional in Japan before the introduction of cotton. So yeah, Boro textiles looks very much like a colour study in which multiple shades of indigo are like patched and neatly quilted together. It's stitched using Sashiko stitches, and Boro covers all the holes, and say for example where your elbows have worn out, like on here, it reinforces the areas as well. When you quilt multiple layers together, so typically Boro be maybe 2-3 layers of cloth, the oldest piece of cloth will be sandwiched in the middle, and that enabled the cloth to have some use and still be used to make the fabric warmer, especially to wear during the winter months. But then it's also hiding the age of the fabric. So when garments, so say for example, when they used to wear Boro garments, so when they used to wear them, when they would wear out and you just couldn't patch it any longer, the fabric would then still be precious and taken out of the clothing and then maybe quilted into workwear, which then maybe would eventually work its way out into maybe bags, aprons, household textiles, cleaning cloths for use around the home. So when you think traditional Japan and contemporary culture, I think there's a lot to kind of be said around wanting to use up every scrap of cloth and make sure that nothing was wasted. We very much live in a kind of throwaway culture now, where we just don't think twice about buying fabric, the knock-on environmental impact of the production of that fabric, the dye that might have been used, the breakdown of microplastics in the washing machine. I don't know, it's just we don't really think in the same way. Maybe that's because we're so used to industrial processes and things made by the machine. We're not used to making things ourselves and making sure that it's repaired. I think culture has a huge impact on our practices and our making and our survival, really. So Boro was a technique that was used out of necessity. People who were using the technique in Japan were also they just didn't have the money to waste, and every bit of cloth and fabric, they were living at a time where you couldn't get much of it. So I think this is really lovely, that their expression as well. So of motanini, I can't ever pronounce it, but motanini, it conveys a sense of regret concerning waste. So when you think about now, we buy jeans with rips in, we buy fast fashion that doesn't last, it's not built to last. They wouldn't you wouldn't want to be seen to be holy and tattered and ragged. You still had a sense of pride in what you looked like, and I think that's how Sashiko developed, really. And they want it to look beautiful whilst also not wasting anything. This is a really, really gorgeous example of the kimono robe that would have been used and worn by a peasant farmer or fisherman in the late 19th century. It's made entirely of recycled fabric, and it's pieced together with patches and further repaired elements of when it broke down even more. So when you look around the collar, there's an additional patches added on at a later date. They are recycled indigo dyed cotton like pieces. It does look quite contemporary, but for a kimono as well, when you compare this to the gorgeous silk embroidered kimonos, this is just cotton and embroidered. We're very much used to seeing the luxurious version of this type of garment, but the garment's quite, I find it even more interesting though, because it actually reveals traces of history of its user rather than being kept in a bag and kept for best. I think it's you wouldn't use it for special occasions. You'd live in it, you would work in it. It would be a very functional piece of clothing that would be worn until it fell off you. So when you have a look at this on screen and have a look at its sleeve, like I said, it reveals traces of its use. So the shredded end of the sleeve suggests that the wearer was left-handed. And over the years, it might have broke down in that sleeve up part, where out of reusing and maybe rubbing friction, it might have just broken down the stitching. But then you can see that it has been conserved. I don't know whether the V&A have put that patch in because it does very much stand out, or whether it's just revealing the base of the patch. I'm not quite sure. But it's quite interesting, the sleeves on this. So they're quite unusual for a kimono. I think perhaps the shape was dictated by the shape of the material available, but many examples of original robes and kimonos and workwear and Boro pieces just weren't built to last. They were built to be worn, and the longevity of the items is very low. So few examples do exist. Sashiko stitching. So Sashiko is a crucial part of the mending technique of Boro. It translates from Japanese to English. I think I pronounced it wrong. I think it's Sashiko, rather than Sashiko. I think that's very much a British way of pronouncing it. But it means little stabs lit a pierce, and there's nothing too fancy about it. It is a variation of running stitch that is worked through multiple layers of fabric, and it is used for a decorative reinforcement and to quilt layers of the cloth together. So going back to what I said before about the oldest part of the cloth being in the middle of the fabric. So it's worked in continuous lines where many of the patterns are the same on the front and the back. When working on a double-sided design, knots weren't traditionally used. Tail threads were kind of patchworked in between the multiple layers of the cloth. And a lot of the time as well, these knots were hidden, but like sometimes it's quite nice to have that on show where you started off. But usually sometimes they wouldn't even knot the fabric. So a temporary away knot would be used, which you can easily pull out. And then the tail threads threaded the back side or the middle of the stitching as well. So when I say that it is a folk textile, it evolved out of practical need and warmth and for strength of the fabric. So it was often the process of stitching sashiko was often winter work for those living in farming and fishing villages to extend the life of everyday fabrics mend and winterize clothing, and also to look beautiful and to embellish everyday items around the home. Quite similar to what we do now. We make bags, we make cushions, we make curtains, we make anything that we think is beautiful. I think those ways of thinking and wanting to our environments to be gorgeous haven't changed and won't alter very much between cultures. Our environment is very important to us. But it originated in the north of Japan during the Edo era, and that was between 1615 and 1866. And then it also spread south along trade routes. So by the Meiji era, between 1868 and 1912, it was well established across the whole of Japan. So when we flick through to the next slide, there is a book here which is put together by an artist, so a designer and textile artist, whose interest in Japanese textiles began when she was teaching English in Japan. Susan now lives in Scotland, and she also teaches patchwork and Sashiko quilting. She writes and designs for patchwork magazines and books, but she also brought out this fabulous book, which I couldn't recommend highly enough. Traditionally, Sashiko is sewn with white stitches on dark indigo fabric, which is a classical combination. If you think of white caps on the ocean, dark blue mountains topped with snow, I guess I'm kind of romanticizing it in a way, but in truth, the traditional colours actually evolved from poverty and an oppressive class structure. I think this is incredibly interesting as well, because this technique evolved out of the ruling classes of Japan actually establishing complicated laws that govern dress and colours of the peasant classes. And these very laws forbid the lower classes from wearing things like materials like silk. They weren't allowed to wear bright colours and large patterns. But ironically, these laws actually encourage innovations in dyeing techniques as people sought out alternatives to forbidden colours. I think it relates very much. I can see kind of a lot of correlation in Shibori, which is also a resist dyeing technique. I'm just going to read a little bit from this book, as I think it describes it really well. You can see the similarities of it as well. So if you look on the screen at the stitching that is on the left-hand side, you can see that the stitches are quite similar to Sashiko, where the fabric's been pinched, and then it's very much about being bound, so being bound together with elastic bands, resisted with using things like cardboard to bound it on. You twist, fold, pinch, anyway, put pegs on to create these patterns when using indigo dye. So Shibori is now a universal term. It is a Japanese word for manipulating fabric when dyeing. The word is derived from the Japanese root verb shiboru, which means to wring, squeeze, and press. And it has become well known with many forms of resist dyed fabric. The best way to describe shibori is as a sophisticated tie-dye or stitched resist fabric. And it has a really rich history of shibori in Japan, but it's not unique to Japan. Similar techniques have been found in many cultures across the world, including Africa, China, Europe, India, Indonesia, Korea, Malaya, and both North and South America. It is known by many other names, and the shibori is just typical, as I mentioned before, of Japan. The technique of shibori in Japan dates back between the 6th and 8th centuries, where it was probably learned from the Chinese. as early examples of tide and bound resist were found preserved in the wooden half star of the great Buddhist temple Todaiji. So I won't go too much into that, but I highly recommend actually having a little bit of research yourself around Shibori. I bought this fabulous book, which is by Janice Gunner, and she is a fabulous artist that just explains a little bit. So this book is aimed at quilters, embroiderers and textile artists who not only want to master the techniques of Shibori, but also find ways of using the fabric for a range of textile applications. This book covers a historical and cultural background and also step-by-step instructions. And I will move on to not spend too much time on that. And also just talk to you briefly about indigo. So the history of indigo dates back in Japan at least 400 years. It was found in the 1600s. It was prized for its ability to cling onto cotton fabric, and actually in the fabric heyday, it is estimated that 80% of all clothing in Japan was indigo dyed. This image is taken from a house, a traditional indigo dyeing house called Hijeta Indigo House, and it has roots in the Edo period. It's one of the oldest and longest running dye houses in Japan, and those who visit can see how the leaves of the indigo plant are dried and fermented and how the dye is made. For much of Japan's history, fabric was made from linen or hemp, and cotton farming began in the 1600s. So while cotton was softer on the skin than hand-woven hemp, it was also quite difficult to dye unless you used indigo. So I'm not sure if anyone has actually ever done any eco dyeing, but usually when you're dyeing, it goes through this process of more dating. So say if I was to go dye a piece of cloth from using turmeric, for example, usually to make the fabric more porous, I would soak it in soy milk. But obviously at the time, they didn't have access to all the dyes that we have now, which are a lot stronger. Indigo was their equivalent at the time. So, and you can see by his hands, it's stuck to absolutely everything. When you buy it, you can buy it now, and it mixes and it smells really strong of egg, and it's actually quite greeny brown. It's only when it reacts with the fabric and it's left a long time that it goes blue. It's quite interesting as well, because when you think of all the indigo dye houses, that environmental impact of all the dye going into the lakes and rivers and into the drinking water, we couldn't get away with it now, I think, using it on such a large scale. It's kind of like when you go back down in history and think about oil painting and our use of different chemicals that on lead paint that just weren't any good for us. I think indigo is in the same way, even from inhaling the powders, even though it's natural, it's a natural dye. I don't quite think that it's healthy to be used on this kind of mass scale. However, any synthetic dyes now probably aren't either. So as much as the colours were set in stone, the patterns of Sashiko were not. Huge variety of patterns, mainly adopted from motifs from other textiles, architecture and ceramics were used. And after the Edo period's laws were lifted in Japan, Sashiko took on another life, even more larger and varied than before. The next slide is just some examples of Sashiko patterns that I've taken from a website called The Spruce Crafts, which I've detailed in your email to you as a follow-up. Much of the patterns are inspired by nature. So you might see similarities of patterns in clouds, rippling water, tortoise shells, waves, flowers, leaves, diamonds. Designs are often geometric, including interlocking lines, including stars, squares, triangles, circles, repeating shapes that interlocked using tessellating designs. So each pattern has a history to it and has special meanings and common uses. So for example, hishi, or the diamond shape, which isn't detailed on here, but I've sent it to you in an email, is often seen in home decor. The hexagonal kiko design, which is also known as a turtle shell or beehive, which is detailed at the bottom left of here, which looks like the kind of fan as well. It's often considered a good symbol of good fortune. So I think part of your homework task is just to have a look at these Sashiko patterns via the Spruce Crafts and just decide for yourself which one you'd like to incorporate in your bag. Some are a lot easier than others, so I would probably recommend as a starting point using the ones that I've sent to you in the email. However, do have a look at the website and just see if there might be a certain element of it that you really adore and want to incorporate in some way. So do have a look. The next slide just details the measurements of your bag. So ultimately, between this week and our next week together, what I would love for you to do is make sure that you have all your materials and equipment to hand, so you're ready to start. A huge suggestion, just make sure that if you're buying new fabric, make sure you're going to pre-wash it, because the worst thing is spending hours on this beautiful white stitching and then putting in the washing machine and then all your indigo dye going into your stitching and discolouring it. So do make sure that you're going to pre-wash your fabric. A few of the other people on the course were thinking about using shirts, older fabric, maybe bed sheets that have been washed multiple times. This would be great, as you know that it's not going to shrink as well. So, and it's also very much in the ethos of Boro and Sashiko. So on screen are the measurements. We're going to be working in one kind of large panel. So if you have a look at the bag foundation measurements, this all incorporates your seam allowance as well. So do just cut out your bag foundation this week for next week start. So have a think about designs as well. So for example, on screen they've kept it quite simple because of the patches. So the Sashiko stitching is quite simple and only worked in interlocking running straight lines, and I think they've made this decision because they've put so many patches on. So on here there is the option to have short handles or longer handles, so there's the dimensions for those as well. The assorted patches are completely dependent on your arrangement. I'll show you some of the fabrics that I sourced, and but God, it can be old socks, it can be any old discarded fabrics that you just want to use in something, or I've been waiting for the perfect project. So don't feel like you have to go out and buy everything new. I will show you actually a couple of variations. So I had a look on Pinterest just and pulled off some pictures. So you can see on here that there's a bag which is covered in kind of ripped denim, and they've incorporated green and orange and striped fabric. So it can be a real assortment. Like the top of on this screen, there's some like lovely velvets and blues, and they've mixed that with pinks and greens and yellows. So it might be that you have a bag full of patches, or you might keep it quite simple and just have the indigo blue with some simple stitching. I do encourage you to put a couple of patches on, just so then you can learn the process of Boro. What we will be doing as well is when we're attaching the handles on, those handles are going to be covered. So we're not going to line the bag. The bag is you're going to be able to see the stitching on the inside and the outside of your bag. It's quite flexible, so you might even have the option, if you want, when you finish your bag, to put a pocket in. If you want to line it, you can. But ultimately what we're going to be doing together is just making a tote bag and practicing Sashiko and Boro on it, on the construction. Next time we're going to be looking a lot more at Sashiko patterns and also the design of your fabric. But what else will you need to know? I will stop sharing and I'll show you some of the fabrics that I have got. So I detailed on the email where I got this from. I think I got it from Etsy. Up close, it's got a really lovely like pattern to it. So because the opposite on the colour wheel, so thinking about complementary colours with this indigo blue, there is yellow and orange opposite, so quite warm colours next to these cool blues will look lovely. So I've got some older, like blue stripe, quite heavily patterned fabric, so I might use that in smaller pieces. I've got some like grey, which is quite a silky fabric. I've also got this. I've gone a bit overboard. I don't think that I'm going to be using all of that. But I might use it in really small patches and the options there. I'm going to just have a play around next week by seeing what it all looks like. This is quite thick as well, so I'm not sure whether that will come in, because obviously the thicker that you work with your fabric, the harder it is going to be to stitch. Some lovely orange. It looks very bright on screen, but I would like to use that one. I think this is just a cotton as well. I have also got, this was the start of a cushion, and this is, kind of shows you roughly how I would go about translating that pattern onto fabric, but we will cover this next time in a little bit more detail. But if you get your pattern printed, or if you get it just to hand, even if it's just being able to see it on the screen next time, that would be really helpful. Your patterns look like this. So that is that pattern. So what you do, you get it without any of the kind of guides on, and then that's when you're looking for the repetition. So in this, the repetition is obviously the full flower, or the full circle, or the full diamond shape, however you see it. But also it's about breaking that down and just thinking about one little element of it. So in this, it's actually just, it's each one of those petals. So it's kind of like being cut like a pizza. So if you just think of this one square, that's then being quartered. So it's all about fitting this pattern into a grid, a 2x2, a 4x4, 1x1, an even square grid. Same with that, that's gridded. So I just mean there's lines going across and down to just section it off. So we're just looking at this one piece. And same with that. And same with that one. So I've started to plan the pencil marks on there. So I realised that the actual repetition was half of these like shell, scale, rainbow ones. So that's why I've found the repetition there. You can see it here where I split it up fully. So this square is the same size as this square, this square, this square, this square. And Sue details it quite good in her book. So she actually explains that some of the grids are actually rectangles. So they're not always square, sometimes they're rectangles, but we're going to be working in just an even square grid to make sense of it. So you can see there, but even square grid, just for ease, simplicity, and then you can see there. So we will be doing that a little bit more next time. I will show you this example of a cushion that I made. So your patches don't have to necessarily be all square and rectangle, they can be circle. I was inspired by that pattern on that one, and I quite liked the repetition of the circles on it, and that's why I thought, oh, I'll go for a moon, a full moon, half moon, and then I'll fill in the kind of gaps. So you can be quite simple with the patches and it still looks quite lovely. I'll show you some of the images. So that one's quite lovely as well. So your different patches could be with different patterns on. I don't know if there's any more here. That's one more. This was just a cyanotype fabric, which I've just kind of done random patterns all over, which I think is still quite effective. In terms of needles, so you can get specialised Sashiko needles, and they came in a lovely little box, like test tube like that. These are roughly about 1.5 inches in length, but I found that a long, sharp darning needle is a cheaper option. I think those needles would break the bank. They're about $6.50, and then postage was about $3.50 as well. So it's not a cheap option. Whereas these long, sharp darning needles, which are about £2, are. Crochet cotton is the best material to use for the stitching. So silk embroidery floss tends to split the thread split, the skin like splits, whereas if this is tightly wound and will not, no matter how much you try and undo it, it might eventually if you keep twisting it, but it keeps it's tightly wound, so it won't come undone easily. It's in line with the fabrics that you might use, so it's made out of cotton. It would dye if you wanted it to, however we're not going to dye it. It is quite affordable, so I got this ball from Boys and that was about £5 for the whole thing. I'm not quite sure on its size. I know you can get different thickness of crochet cotton. This one's slightly thinner, so it doesn't matter as long as it fits through your eyelet. You can use embroidery skins if you just don't have anything else, but the sheen and the embroidery thread just not as eye-catching as the crochet cotton. You'll also need just some blue thread to stitch it all up with. You can stitch the bag either using a sewing machine for extra like stability and sturdiness, or you can stitch the whole bag by hand. It's completely up to you. So you will need some hand needles as well. You need a ruler, and you also need some fabric scissors. You will also need, in addition, some tailor's chalk, which I can't remember where I put it. Some tailor's chalk here. I found these ones quite good because you can always sharpen them for a point, but you can also get it in this kind of form as well. And that will be everything you need apart from a tape measure to measure your fabric. So what I would like you to do is make sure you've got a pattern. Make sure that you have an idea in mind about what your bag is going to look like. And also what I would like you to do is to cut your base fabric to scale. So the measurements, what were they again? They were, I've detailed them on the email, so I will stop talking now and I will see you next week. But do email me if you have any questions and if I can help at all. But enjoy, and I will speak to you very soon. Bye.